Hi, I'm Pam, and I'm here to talk about retro video games. Today, I'm talking about a beautiful musical game about the end of the world, and the start of a new one. It's Loom. Where do stories come from? Maybe inspiration is taken from real-life events. Maybe it comes in a dream, or borrows from someone else's stories. But when it came to a tale about a young weaver named Bobbin Threadbare and the Great Loom's ability to make and unmake the world, inspiration came from an ad in a computer magazine. In this ad, a circuit board, the thing that supports and connects electronic components, was referred to as a loom. Upon seeing this, Brian Moriarty has said, the idea for the 1990 Lucasfilm adventure game came to him, complete and whole. The first concept document for Loom was dated August 18, 1988, just 3 weeks after Moriarty started working for Lucasfilm. Prior to this, he had worked for Infocom, where he designed and developed 3 text adventures: Wishbringer, Trinity, and Beyond Zork. But all was not well at Infocom. Wanting to branch out and improve profits, Infocom attempted to get into the business software market and developed a database program called Cornerstone. The program was a commercial failure, and Infocom had to lay off 100 staff. Then in swooped Activision. While this originally seemed like a rescue, Activision soon started demanding more games be developed each year with less resources to make them. Activision, ruining everything since 1986. Infocom would be closed by 1989, but Moriarty got out before then. The situation after the takeover had him primed to be poached. At the 1988 West Coast Computer Fair, he met game designer Noah Falstein, who recruited him to work in a much more idyllic environment. Thus began his journey at Lucasfilm Games. Bobbin Threadbare's journey begins on his 17th birthday. Bobbin is part of the Guild of Weavers. The Weavers had started out as masters of woven cloth, but eventually they began practicing a kind of magic, giving them the ability to influence the very fabric of reality using their Great Loom. This power caused distrust and persecution from the other guilds, so the Weavers lived in isolation, on an island away from the rest of the world. Through Bobbin's life, he had endured an extra layer of isolation. The circumstances of his birth were mysterious, and soon after, the Elders began to see chaos emerging in the pattern of the world. Blaming Bobbin for it and fearing what he could do, they refused to train him in the ways of weaving. As the game begins, Bobbin's fate is to be decided. He wakes up on a beautiful overlook and makes his way down to the village. At this point, there's not a ton for the player to do. You can explore the few tents on the beach, see where the other weavers dye cloth and spin straw, but you've not yet been given your main way of interacting with the world. Stepping into the sanctuary that houses the Great Loom, Bobbin overhears the head elders discussing his fate with his guardian, Hetchel. Hetchel had secretly been teaching Bobbin, and they are not pleased. Their attempt to punish her doesn't go exactly as planned, and she turns into an egg. Suddenly, a swan breaks through the glass window and casts a Transcendent draft, which turns all the weavers into swans, and the whole ballet, that's the name for a group of swans, flies away across the water. Bobbin is left alone. A distaff has been left behind, dropped by one of the elders during their transformation. This is the tool that lets the weavers cast drafts and manipulate the world. It will also be the player's main way of interacting with the game. Loom's interface is quite different from other Lucasfilm adventure games of the late 80s and early 90s. They use the script creation utility for Maniac Mansion, better known as the Scum engine. It's a verb-object interface, a list of verbs to choose from on screen, which can then be paired with objects in the world or in the player's inventory. With Loom, Moriarty was looking to let players interact with the game in a more unique way. The original idea was to have the game's spells represented by shapes, and have the player draw the shape on screen in order to cast. However, at the time of development, not every home computer came with a mouse, and the game needed to be controllable with just a keyboard. Instead, they were able to alter the engine to use a modified interface that has no verbs or inventory, and featured only the distaff and whatever item the player was focused on. The distaff, which consists of 8 different musical notes, is used to cast a series of drafts, which are 4 notes each. Loom came with a book of patterns for players to record the drafts that they've learned. This is a nice tactile addition and a more satisfying way to record your journey than a scrap of paper or a notebook. Not all of the drafts in here are actually used, but many give hints of the kinds of things you'll be doing later in the game. With distaff in hand, Bobbin's adventure can really begin. The first thing to do is help Hetchel by casting Open on her egg, hatching her new signet form. She tells Bobbin that chaos is threatening the pattern of the world, and he must find the weavers if he wants to survive. Again, you can wander through the village, but now you can manipulate the world around you. You can dye cloth green or spin straw into gold. As you learn more drafts and become more adept at weaving, new notes will open up to you. After thoroughly exploring and solving a little puzzle, you find a way off the island, and for the first time, Bobbin gets to see the rest of the world. The world of Loom is one of industry, controlled by great guilds, and Bobbin will encounter a number of them on his journey. When he comes ashore on the mainland, the beautiful emerald city of the glassmakers is visible, and when venturing into the forest, he comes upon the protective and honestly kind of dickish shepherds. Loom has an interesting way of teaching you new things. When you first stumble upon the shepherds, they are invisible, and 4 notes play as they apparate. The notes play backwards as they disappear again. Here's where you write down the draft in your little spellbook and look for where else in the world it might be useful to appear or disappear from the sight of those around you. In this case, it helps you to eavesdrop on the glassmakers. For a short game, there is an incredible amount of lore and story in Loom, so much that it couldn't all fit in the game. As Brian Moriarty wrote the adventure, he also wrote an audio drama in tandem. This told the history of the Great Guilds as well as more of Bobbin's backstory. It tells of how the children of the Weavers are dying and they are becoming barren. Signa, a bereaved mother, goes to the elders and asks them to use the power of the loom to fix this, but they refuse. In her grief, she inadvertently draws a child directly from the loom. This is Bobbin. Signa is charged with treason and turned into a swan. It is determined that Bobbin will be raised outside of the ways of the Weavers until his 17th birthday. But in part 3 of the audio drama, we hear Hetchel teaching him in secret, quizzing him on how drafts work and what notes to play to bend the physical world to his will.
This is called a distaff. Our ancestors used a distaff to spin flax into thread. We use it to spin music and light into threads of influence.
Show me.
Hold the distaff in your hands. Like this. Don't be afraid. Now, spin that draft I taught you again.
The audio drama was recorded by BBC actors and is extremely well done. Many of the same actors would eventually record spoken dialogue for the CD release of the game.
I'm looking for a flock of swans.
Swans?
Swans! You know, birds.
Oh, swans, of course.
We should have known. Everybody comes here when they want swans.
An audio tape was included in the original packaging for the game that included this prologue, along with some of the game's music on the B-side. Unfortunately for the people who bought a later release of the game or got it as part of a compilation, like I did, this tape was not always included. This left some gaps in the story that wouldn't be answered until the end of the game, if at all. When eavesdropping on the glassmakers, you learn that Bishop Mandible, from the Guild of Clerics, is after a scrying sphere. As you meet the other guilds, you'll also find out he's after enough sheep to feed an army and a whole lot of swords. Almost like he's planning on a war. After learning about the scrying sphere, Bobbin moves on to the Shepherd's area. All of his encounters are a little on the awkward side, though he's generally well-meaning. After he's gained the trust of the shepherds, he's tasked with saving their flock of sheep. A dragon in the area has been feasting on them as they graze in the fields. The player must figure out which of the drafts you've learned may help in this situation. As it turns out, the dragon can't carry off sheep if it can't see them, so your green dye spell comes in handy. Unfortunately, the dragon can still see Bobbin and carries him off instead. This leads to both some comedic conversation and a daring escape from the dragon's lair, but also one of the game's least successful segments as Bobbin wanders around a mountainous maze. He next meets the Guild of Blacksmiths via a lazy apprentice named Rusty. Bobbin is able to use a newly discovered Reflect spell to take on Rusty's appearance so he can enter the blacksmith's forge. However, things go sideways again as Bobbin is first put in a cell as punishment for Rusty not performing his chores, and then is discovered eavesdropping on a conversation between the bishop and the blacksmith leader. Bobbin is captured, and in true villain monologuing fashion, Mandible reveals that he wants to fulfill a prophecy that will let him rule the world by raising an army of undead. The final object he needs to raise the dead is a weaver's distaff, and now he's captured a weaver. Loom was developed to be a different kind of adventure game. Based on the registration cards that Infocom received, Moriarty found that few players actually completed their games, and he wanted to make something that people would finish. This meant a game that was shorter and lacked real blockers as far as puzzles and difficulty went. One Infocom game that players finished most often was Moriarty's own Wishbringer, which had been developed to be easier and an introduction to interactive fiction for new players. He wanted to do something similar here. Also, like LucasArts had first started attempting with Zak McKraken and the Alien Mindbenders, and mastered with The Secret of Monkey Island, there was no real way to die, get stuck, or lose the game. Loom ended up being on the easier side and relatively short, taking only a couple hours to finish, depending on how quickly you solve the puzzles. There are multiple difficulty modes, but they really just affect how you play your drafts. In standard mode, when a pattern is played, you see the different colored sections of your distaff light up, and you can see the notes used. On expert, you get no notes and no colored sections. You need to have a good ear to play in this mode. At the end of the game, even on standard, you need to cast one last draft with no visual help. As someone not well versed in music, this was the most difficult part by far. The puzzles, though, are all fairly straightforward for an adventure game of this era. On release, Loom was critically acclaimed, though it didn't sell as well as Lucasfilm would have liked. Reviewers did comment on the brevity and lack of challenge. Brian Moriarty reflected on this himself in a recent GDC talk.
The game was generally admired by the press. Everyone praised the art and the music, and thank goodness even the story. They politely noticed that Loom was a bit easier and a bit shorter than most games, but agreed that these qualities made it a good game for children and beginners. who don't read these magazines.
As I played through Loom for this video, for the first time in many years, I was actually quite surprised at the thought that this was a game more suited for children. It can get very dark. Bobbin encounters and even causes a lot of death throughout his adventure. At the beginning, as he attempts to reach the cemetery outside the Weaver village, he scares a rabbit out of some bushes and it's quickly grabbed by an owl to be devoured. When trying to help the shepherds, he's asked if he can heal the sick lamb, but you don't yet have the notes available to cast the heal spell. I remember being really sad as a kid that I couldn't save that lamb. And things only escalate from here. When he uses the reflection spell on Rusty, not only does Bobbin take on his appearance, but Rusty now looks like Bobbin, who had just destroyed a dragon's lair and stolen her treasure. The dragon eats poor Rusty. When Bobbin is captured by Bishop Mandible, he's left alone with a character named Cobb. You may recognize him from the Scum Bar in The Secret of Monkey Island, wearing a button that provokes you to ask him about Loom. Cobb is less friendly here and is curious about a rumor he's heard that looking under a weaver's hood can kill you. Turns out, the rumor is correct. Goodbye, Cobb. Having escaped due to Cobb's misfortune, Bobbin catches up to Bishop Mandible only to find he's too late. Mandible has raised the dead, summoned chaos, and torn the very fabric of the world. Chaos has no loyalty to the bishop, though, and with a very cool animation created by Steve Purcell, obliterates him. Chaos then goes forth to kill pretty much everyone you just met. Kids game? Really? Before we get to the finale, I need to talk about the beautiful art in this game, as well as the different versions that have been released. While Loom was being developed, LucasArts was still using EGA graphics, which offered a display of up to 16 colors. Much of the environmental art was done by Mark Ferrari, who had also worked on Zak McKraken and had come from a background of traditional art. He was used to colored pencils, not computers. Mark hated the EGA color palette, something I can sympathize with. He said it was like looking through the eyes of a circus clown on pupil dilators, with its tacky fuchsias and lime greens. He attempted to make the art more appealing with dithering, a method of juxtaposing pixels of two colors to create the illusion of a third color. This did make everything look better, but the programmers said it took up too much disk space and didn't compress well. So Zak McKraken went without dithering. With Loom, though, Mark continued his protests and displays of what the art could look like if he was allowed to use the technique. Eventually, the programmers figured out how to make it work. As a result, Loom is possibly the only game where I think the EGA version is as appealing as the eventual VGA remake. In addition to the well-executed graphics and the extra work put into the color palette, it also includes close-up character portraits, which would not appear in the later versions. The first remake came in 1991, which was a release for Japan. It also got released for the TurboGrafx. But the final and ultimate edition was for PC CD-ROM in 1992, with a full VGA remake that also added the voice acting.
My actions speak for themselves.
This reckless defiance is intolerable. Any secret you share with Cygna's son might be turned against us.
However, only so much sound could fit on one CD, so some of the dialogue had to be abridged. This version also featured a re-recorded digital soundtrack. This was the first LucasArts game to get a full VGA remake. It was also one of the first American PC games to have a soundtrack created for it. Loom's music features excerpts from Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake, which were remixed and produced by George the Fat Man Sanger, who also worked on games like The Seventh Guest and Zombies Ate My Neighbors. In addition to Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty also provided some inspiration for Loom. Moriarty and the artists wanted to capture the feel of some of the movie's landscapes, and it's clear that the art for Chaos was inspired by Maleficent. Bobbin makes his way through the torn fabric of the world and is met with portals to each of the areas he had visited before. Near the blacksmith's great anvil, he finds the remains of Rusty, whose ghost gives him a much-deserved tongue-lashing. At this point, Bobbin has learned enough to cast the heal draft and brings him back to life. Next come the shepherds, who lay dying in their fields. Bobbin heals them as well, and they promise to remember him. The glassmaker Master Goodmold tells Bobbin of how they could have fought off Chaos and his undead minions with the great sight they possess, but they refuse to do so, being unable to show the same lack of mercy as their enemies. The glassmakers face death with clarity and bravery and want to be remembered for it. Goodmold's body disappears, and Bobbin is unable to bring him back to life. As Bobbin leaves each of these places, he needs to close the tears and the paths to the world behind him. Finally, he is reunited with the Weavers in a beautiful star-filled lake of swans, where he meets, for the first time, his mother. She tells her story, how she created him and was punished for it, that she would come to visit secretly on each of Bobbin's birthdays. But there's little time for family reunions. Chaos and Mother Hetchel are facing off over the Great Loom. You need to unmake the loom before Chaos gains control of it, and then transcend, turning into a swan yourself. You do this, and it seems like a victory, but it's actually a very sad ending. When the Weavers unmake the loom and fly off, they're leaving everyone else to an uncertain fate, under Chaos's rule. The plan is to fly away, remake the world's pattern, and return to vanquish Chaos and put everything right. But the game ends there, on a cliffhanger. A beautiful cliffhanger, though, as the final sight of the swans flying through the night sky, carrying the fabric of the world behind them, is stunning. Loom manages to be incredibly emotionally affecting in its final third. The combination of the beautiful music, intense visuals, and the fact that the game has actual stakes and isn't afraid to kill people make for a real trip. And though I will rarely ever criticize a game for being too short, I can only imagine how much more impactful it could have been if we had spent just a little more time with the other characters, gotten to know their guilds and their lives a bit more thoroughly. Though Loom was conceived as a potential trilogy, it was not to be. A sequel, called Forge, planned to tell the tale of Rusty, who would attempt to regain the Great Blacksmith and free the rest of his guild. LucasArts did some work on this title after Loom's release, though without Moriarty. Noah Falstein has said he has multiple iterations of the game's design document, but by 1994, it had been cancelled. Around this time, LucasArts was just throwing resources at wrapping up the troubled development of The Dig. A company called Quill of the Wisp started work on a fan game for the Forge, but their website's last development update was in 2015. We may never know if Bobbin and the Weavers managed to return to defeat Chaos, or what happened to the people who remained behind. But it was a beautiful musical journey while it lasted. And that is the story of Loom. I think this is a somewhat underappreciated game in LucasArts' catalog. Perhaps because of its relatively easy difficulty and short length, it just wasn't taken as seriously as some of the others. However, I appreciate that it's a game full of beauty and emotion, but it's lacking the moon logic that makes many other adventure games frustrating to play. I really hope this video did the game justice. If you want to see another deep dive on a LucasArts game, check out my retrospective on The Dig, or watch another of my videos. I have a Patreon if you want to support what I'm doing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.